Hello, this is the podcast from the international research platform SIMM, with reports and interviews from across the world on the role music can play in social and community programs. I am Lucas Perron. So, hello Jonathan Vaughan. You're the interim principal of the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and you are yourself I don't know how you do that, but combining this with a PhD project on artistic citizenship and especially what conservatories in different countries provide in terms of training, preparation for musicians who want to engage themselves in social, let's call them social and community music projects. So thank you for being with us. This episode is exactly about this theme. So thank you also for putting us in touch with Louise Zeitlin and the Oberlin Conservatory of Music and their community music school. That's a very clear example of a conservatory who is focusing seriously on preparing and accompanying musicians who want to engage themselves in this type of work.
Thank you, Lucas. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. Great to be speaking to you today. I know this is at the heart of all that you're achieving as well. So I look forward to our conversation.
You are at a point in your PhD, I believe, which will allow you to already tell us a bit about certain examples that you think are interesting of university colleges, of conservatories who are proposing such type of accompaniment and training. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, for sure. Maybe we should just rewind a little bit. I've entitled mine Artistic Citizenship, and it's I know it's a contestable title, but it speaks to the American academic sector. Particularly, it's a phrase that's been adopted strongly over there. And one of the first things I needed to do in trying to understand what that meant was to do a big literary review. So there were a number of elements that came out of that I decided were going to be really important in looking at the 26 institutions that I did around the world. So if it's okay, I'll start by outlining what those were. And so that people can understand exactly what I was looking for.
Yes, please do.
So it became very evident that there are a number of factors which contribute to the idea of artistic citizenship and to what degree particularly classical music has set itself apart from the rest of society. And one of those which John Dewey was adamant about was the idea of the masterwork, that we had these heroic composers that wrote masterworks that were, elite and privileged and different from the rest of the world. And he felt this was very corrosive to society and to the idea that you put people on an aesthetic pedestal in an attempt to protect and isolate a privileged elite, and how toxic this was to social justice and actually reaching out to everyday people.
Yeah, the possibility of participation.
Yes, exactly. So that was one element. The second, which fascinates me, is the distortion of the historic narrative, and the idea that, as Churchill famously said, history is written by the victors. And there's a great example of this in Francis Stoner Sauner's book, Who Paid the Piper, which is about the CIA and how they manipulated culture after the Second World War during the Cold War to distort the historic narrative. They wanted a kind of American Weimar in Europe, and they funded a great deal of, commissioned a great deal of plays, poets, musicians. They re-established Wengler as a heroic conductor in order to feed this narrative. And certainly my generation absorbed this as the truth. And, the point Dewey and then subsequently Paul Woodford make about this is, unless you understand where you've come from, you are a product of of that social narrative and historic narrative. And if you don't understand that it may have been distorted very deliberately by ruling classes, then you can't really make transformational change in society. So the second element was about distorting the historic provenance and narrative. And then the third is the idea of putting music to work, the instrumentalization of art, and as opposed to art for art's sake. Mm-hmm. And Elliot Silverman and Bowman have written this fabulous book called Artistic Citizenship, which has been one of my Bibles. And they say there are three elements to this, that the arts are made by and for people, that art making and art taking needs to be integrated with personal and community life, and that the arts are inherently social practices and should therefore be viewed, studied and practiced as forms of ethically guided citizenship.
And that's exactly what's more and more of our today musicians are keen on being involved in, no?
Absolutely. And I'm seeing that hunger within students at the Guildhall. Whenever we do any of these kinds of symposiums, they mob us and say, how can we get involved? I have huge optimism for this generation, that they're so genuinely passionate about all of these questions. One of the things that I felt problematic about artistic citizenship is the word citizenship itself, and this is my fourth element. That's the idea that citizenship implies conformity and, complying with social value. And Anna Vujanovic comes up with a really interesting notion about this, which is art as bad public good. That in fact artists have to be disruptors. They ask the difficult questions of society, and they're actually the good citizens. She makes the case that most liberal governments nowadays work on the basis of capitalism, and capitalism has winners and losers. It's not about equality. And so she therefore concludes that many Western governments are less interested in public good than they ought to be. And so society needs artists as bad public good, this oxymoron.
Yes,
that citizenship is actually about challenging the idea of citizenship itself and the values that the society holds.
To question and to challenge, but also maybe to just dream away.
Absolutely, no? That too. Yes. And to present art that asks some interesting and difficult questions for all of humanity.
Yes.
And then my last element is ethics, and Wayne Bowman has written a fabulous paper about the use of ethics in the context of artistic citizenship. So those were all of the elements that I was looking for when I started this study of these 26 conservatoires around the world. I did a web-based study, and I think my headline findings are that, you mentioned Oberlin at the beginning, Lucas, mm-hmm. and that for me is the go-to institution that has kind of come out top in my research so far. Its values are, built into its DNA from its mission statements. It has civic responsibility, the fight of equality in North America at its heart, and as a result, every aspect of its vision and mission and teaching program is built around this idea of artistic citizenship. And they've got a mouth-watering choice of electives that BEMA's first years can take, which I'm jealous of. I'd love to do. And I think the biggest takeaway from my research is that it seems to be the institutions that are set in bigger universities that have access particularly to liberal arts subjects that are best placed to do this broader study around, the elements that I've described. And, they can call on their psychology departments and sociology departments and have much greater resource than a standalone institution like the Guildhall to really offer a big menu of study that opens students' minds and makes them think in different ways.
Other examples?
There's quite a few. I mean, I think the North American institutions are doing particularly well, and I guess that's born out of civil rights movements and so on, and a sort of awakening in American society about this. I think we'd all agree that American society is not necessarily fair, but certainly the intellectual individuals that are running these institutions are really aware of these questions that they want their students to grapple with and go out into the world and make transformational change through. There are several others that I think are doing particularly well. Sibelius is a case in point. A number of other North European institutions, and I think largely the UK regional conservatoires are doing really well at this stuff.
If you were, for not too short a period, principal of Guildhall, how would you imagine it in the context of Guildhall to propose such an accompaniment training of musicians, preparing them or accompanying them in this type of practice? What are the things that you now already think of as important elements?
My aim right from the beginning was to try and find best practice around the world, bring it back to Guildhall and make recommendations for curriculum change, and then basically redesign certainly the music curriculum. Bear in mind that the school is music, acting and production arts, so we have 3 disciplines. Yes. But certainly music, which is by far the biggest department, that's where I would like to focus. And I think the challenge and tension and balance within all of our institutions is, how do you still focus on performance excellence and making a pianist or a violinist to the level they need to be, whilst also allowing enough time and space for this other work? And I think that's the challenge which many institutions are now grappling with and thinking about.
Yes.
We shouldn't confine our thinking in any way that this is just about outreach skills. I don't think it is. I mean, this is something that many institutions have done a long time. And pretty much every institution I studied had some sort of pedagogic program, albeit sometimes very traditional, simply about instrumental pedagogy. But as well as working in community settings, working in hospitals, working in prisons, working with children, which is an important factor in this, I think there's also a higher calling for artists to think about how they curate and how they commission work to reframe particularly some of the difficult repertoire. A great example, Roddy Williams, who's one of our alumni, the famous singer, was studying Die Schöne Müllerin in preparation for some concerts. And it occurred to him that this is a very patriarchal piece, that it's about the men, it's not really about the maiden. And he commissioned Emily Levy to write a companion work, which was the perspective of the maiden, in a much more kind of feminist way. And I thought this was a really genius piece of curation and commissioning, that you take a beautiful and wonderful piece of the canon like Die Schöne Müllerin and say, okay, viewed through a 21st century lens of feminism, this is problematic, but let's put this other work next to it as a companion work and acknowledge that there are issues in how it's framed, and perhaps set that to rights. And I think that's a really wonderful piece of foresight from Roddy Williams, that he has been able to use his influence as an artist in that way. There are other examples like Julia Bullock in New York, who, as a black soprano, realised that her life as the daughter of two civil rights activists and her life as a soprano could actually meet somewhere in the middle. And she has commissioned 5 black female composers to set slave text by enslaved people. And it became an incredibly popular sellout show in New York. And so it's not simply about the tools for outreach, it's about asking students to think, well, what are you going to program? What's your message to the world as an artist? What are the things you want to say? And how might you use your influence and power as an artist to say those things? And so what might you not only program directly, but what might you commission alongside it that really speaks to this question of social equality? And that's one of the areas I find absolutely fascinating. But to do it well, I think you've got to bring in these questions of a broader understanding of historic provenance and all the other things that I mentioned earlier.
Jonathan, when I hear you talk about the different considerations, thinking about training and initiating and preparing and accompanying musicians who want to be active in social and community projects, it comes to my mind that the music we're talking about can be all kinds of things.
Absolutely, and I think any genre as well. One of the challenges I think we face, well, particularly in the UK, but I've heard other European institutions make this comment too, is that we've lost a lot of the pyramid below us. Of the supply chain has been undermined by government funding for many years. And one of the reasons I wanted to embark on this work in the first place was that I'd come from a very working class background. I'd grown up in a coal mining community. And it was only the fact that I got free lessons at school that I'm even sitting here. And the tragedy is that kids from those backgrounds can no longer afford to get to the level they need to get into music college, because all the funding has been withdrawn for free music lessons in the UK. And one of the outcomes of that is that many kids, feeling disenfranchised, have moved away from classical music and are, putting together garage bands, doing rock and pop and jazz and street music of all kinds, hip hop, rap, and so on, and having their own teaching themselves and learning from YouTube and so on. And so those genres are thriving in a very traditional, almost the way folk music used to be passed on from orally. And I think there's a grassroots there that we need to be able to tap into, because these are kids often from socially difficult backgrounds, and they're precisely the kinds of musicians we need in the future. So the idea that this is a classical patronage and, we've come to solve all of your problems as classical musicians, our music is better than yours, is utterly absurd. And it has to be all inclusive. I think if COVID has taught us anything, it's highlighted the injustices in our society, and I see this work as critical to addressing that. And you know that so well, Lucas, in your own work. You work with some incredibly underprivileged children and see the transformational change it can bring.
So, Louise Zeitlin, you're the director of the Community Music School and also associate professor of community engagement at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music. It's good to have you with us because during this episode we want to talk about training facilities for musicians who want to engage themselves in social and community music projects. And this is what the Community Music School of the Oberlin Conservatory of Music is all about.
Yes, exactly right. Yes, that. And the other part of my job is in our PACE department, which stands for Pedagogy, Advocacy, and Community Engagement. And those are our college students who are learning to be very fine musicians, but also to engage in communities and in different ways within the music world.
So you were involved in starting this training program. How did that come about? How did you come to the conclusion that this kind of training was needed?
Right.
Were musicians more and more contacting the conservatory about this? Can you explain to us how this came about?
Right, sure. So I would like to take the credit for my doing it and it coming about, but I think it was more of a group effort that included our department, our faculty in our conservatory, and also our deans, the top of our conservatory. And I think it really has sort of evolved because music, I think around the world, but particularly in the US, is changing. When I went to school, so this dates me a little bit, but when I went to school, to music school, you hoped that you could get an orchestra job or you teach at a university. And it seemed that there was... it was not easy, but it was possible to make a career. And now I think...
Or teaching in music schools.
Or teaching in music schools, exactly. And I think, the face of music is changing a lot. And our musicians, even those who are at the very tippy top level, there just are not the orchestra jobs in the US, or they may get an orchestra job, but it doesn't pay a full living, and so they have to branch out and do other sorts of work that includes their community and different kinds of groups and audiences. So I think that our conservatory as a whole saw this change and wanted to be training our students in a way that will be very advantageous for them.
Working as a musician in community projects is a very different job than teaching kids or adolescents in music schools.
Absolutely. I think in my mind, the biggest difference really is that you still have to be a really fine musician and play at your very best ability. But our audiences are very different than maybe what they used to be. There's still orchestra concerts in a traditional setting and all of that, and chamber music concerts, of course. But now I think musicians are going out into much more diverse groups and working with them, teaching them, playing concerts for them. And some of these groups, I think, include working at prisons, hospitals, hospice situations. On the other end of the spectrum, working with children in schools, or we have these homeschooling groups where children learn at home. Certainly people with special needs.
What are the talents then that musicians in such jobs need?
So I think a large part of it is really two things: communication skills, and then learning and understanding about your audience. So what are the needs of your audience, and how do you address those needs, and how do you make it relevant to their lives? And so it's not just learning how to play your instrument, but it's really learning about these types of different groups and what will help them.
And then, so to find out also more about the people that you're confronted with, whose background you're maybe not familiar with, and
exactly.
And how can you learn this?
So there are a number of organizations who really specialize in this, and I have to say I know myself, and I think I can speak for my colleagues, that we've all learned a lot in the last few years through these various organizations, but also in working with the people at the other end. So in terms of working in a prison, talking to the head of the prison system and learning about the residents in the prisons and what they need or what can help them, how to work with their rules, that kind of thing. Working with children, obviously, is a completely different thing. You have to learn about the age group and the kinds of things that interest children, and build your programming, your musical programming around, as I say, the needs and the interests of the parties at the other end.
So working together with social and community workers is an important aspect of this working in this context.
Absolutely.
And this is what you encourage and...
Yes. We not only encourage it, but we're starting to offer more and more classes at our conservatory with a focus on this and a specialization in this. We now have an area that specializes in this kind of work, so they can still do their high-level musical studies, but they can also learn about this sort of work and how to integrate what they do with these different groups.
And does that mean that you offer them kind of internships or so in specific situations, like maybe go into music projects, be involved in a music project in a prison or some other contexts?
Yes. So the students have a lot of opportunities. Some of the opportunities are just for the learning experience and the fun. So they don't get paid. They don't get school credit, towards their degree. But for example, our prison program, there is a very popular thing to do. I think the students feel like it's really good work that they're doing with the residents there.
And enriching also.
Absolutely, very much so. But then we also have these classes where, as I say, they get credits towards their degree. And so, for example, my classes, they learn about the subject, but while they're learning about it, they're also learning how to create a partnership with a community organization. They're learning about the people at the organization, and then they do a project throughout the semester, our course of 13 weeks. They do this project that throughout the semester, and then culminates with a final presentation showing the work that they've done over the time.
Do you stay in contact with them after they finished this training program?
That's a really good question. So some of the students, absolutely, and it's really wonderful. I get emails from students saying, I went on to do my graduate work and I had this experience, so I was hired for X, Y, and Z, or whatever it is that they were hired for, and then it becomes a part of their career.
Yes, because in the beginning you said that the music is changing, so the profession of the musician is changing, and
Absolutely.
so you could see this social and community work as like a possible job. Huh? So I guess it's ideally also a job that you would want to do and that you would care for doing. And I guess it's not necessarily attractive to all musicians, this kind of work, but it is to certain musicians. And also, I imagine and I hear also that you learn a lot doing it. And so that's why I ask you also whether you stay in touch with students, musicians who have been following your training program. Are you inviting them, for example, to share their experience with younger, less experienced musicians? Yes?
Yes. Yes, so it's wonderful. So prior to COVID, we would have them come back to campus, to our school, and talk about the work that they've done. And they do, big talks, or they might do a talk for a particular class. We've also done some, video conferencing with people, so that, as you say, the younger students can really hear firsthand from someone who's in the field and doing the work.
Can we talk a little bit about the music which is proposed?
Absolutely, sure.
Whether it's the style of music, our music from the Western world, music from many different other worlds. Is this also an element which comes back in the training program as a point of interest?
Yes, definitely. Again, I think when we look at the different kinds of groups or audiences that we're working with or playing for, we really try to look at their backgrounds. So, for example, I personally have a project in Uruguay, and I'm going down to Uruguay during our winter term. We are going to be working with and learning music of Latin America. And so the students are learning some different kinds of music, traditional music from that part of the world, as well as playing the classical music that they've learned, or maybe the more contemporary classical music that they've learned at school. Again, so let's say we're talking about working with children's orchestras for children, orchestra concerts, for children, children's concerts we call them. You would change the format of a children's concert and the music that you play so that a young child could understand it and could relate to it.
Are the musicians also prepared in how to go about a participatory process, in the sense that how to go about having participants in social and community music projects to really participate in bringing in music, or maybe somehow even composing pieces together? And is this also an element of interest in the training that you propose?
Very, very much so. I think for many people that participation, it's a much more tangible, it has a much more tangible effect. And so teaching our students how to engage so that their audiences are participating. Mm-hmm. So for example, we have a choral program and a strings program at the local prison, and their residents are playing string instruments and singing with our faculty member and our students. We have, when we do our children's orchestra concerts, some of the children are called up to conduct the orchestra. Before the concert, we might have an instrument petting zoo where the children can try out the different instruments, different kinds of things, so that they're really involved in the whole process. And I think for me, I see it bringing a kind of excitement and life to the participants. And again, it's all ages and it's all kinds of people. Even in hospice, which is such a serious and sad time of lives, seeing hospice patients and their families react to the music. Maybe our students are playing music from a part of the world that they're from, and so that they can sing along and be a part of the process. Sing to me.
Bernard Faucroul, welcome to the podcast, the SIMM-podcast. And Bernard, you are an organist as a musician, you're a composer, you've been directing the National Opera of Belgium, the Monet, and since I don't know how many years, the Aix-en-Provence Opera Festival.
Yes, I've been there 12 years in Aix, 15 years in Brussels, 12 years in Aix.
I would like to talk with you about an initiative that you took with your team at the Aix-en-Provence Festival under the name Passerelle. This episode of the SIMM-podcast is interesting itself in training programs and accompanying programs of musicians who maybe also social workers who want to develop social music projects. In fact, Sarah Terry already mentioned it in a previous episode because she profited enormously, she said, from participating in this program.
Yeah, maybe to tell you a little bit the frame. I think today that in the world of opera, there are two priorities. One is to give more room for creators, for living artists in many ways. The other is to really think about the place of the audience. And the more we think about it, the more we come to the conclusion that the audience is not outside the artistic process, it is absolutely inside. And if we take this seriously, it changes a lot of things. We are not producing art for an audience, but we should try to work more and more with an audience. I think we are just at the beginning of that, and I think the cultural rights, as they are defined by the Chart of Fribourg, as they were described in 2007, are still, I think, an important document, still a little bit too theoretical for many of us. I think we really should work on it. So when I arrived in Aix-en-Provence in 2007, I immediately founded an education department, the same as I had done 15 years earlier in Brussels when I arrived there. Yeah. The task of the education department were, first of all, to go to the schools, and then very soon to go to the associations of adults, a lot of people, and try to establish some links with them, to invite them to the festival, to do things with them. And for example, very soon, we started the project of a choir. We benefited from the presence in Aix of Monaim Adwan, who was a Palestinian singer from Gaza. And we started with a choir singing Arabic music every week. 1 week in Marseille, 1 week in Aix, and for many years. And it gave a lot of possibilities of doing things with the choir, but also inviting them, sometimes on stage, sometimes for some specific participatory projects of the festival, and sometimes as an audience. So this is just an example.
So that goes beyond developing the audience.
Yeah. I think it's very important today to enlarge the focus on working with the audience. It's not only giving access. It's not only organizing more tickets for young people. That's very important. And to work on the prices. There are a lot of things to be done.
At the same
but
time,
it's not enough to open the doors to them. Of course, it's very important. But it's also important, if we welcome them, to listen to them. So the more I think about it, the more I think we have to establish a sort of a horizontal relationship and try to give room and space for a dialogue. Of course, it's not possible with all the spectators that we are working with, that we welcome. But the more we can do that with kids, with teenagers, with students, with adults, the more we can enrich the process. And of course, this leads us to a lot of new initiatives.
Does it also lead to different work? Can work be differently composed and to take into consideration what certain audiences can bring in? I'm now asking the question also to you as a composer.
Of course, each piece is different, and there is no real rule, but to answer directly your question, yes, it has an influence. It should have an influence on how we program, how we produce, and so on and so forth. So to give you a few examples, of course, it doesn't alter everything when we do a Mozart opera or a Wagner opera. Yes. Sometimes it will be done just being citizens today. What does it mean today? But not much more than that, And then we have to use a lot of programs to give keys to a young audience, for example, to prepare them.
Initiate them, yes.
We organized a lot of activities within the schools or with associations. But if we speak about programming, for example, step by step, we did quite a lot of things. I would name a few of them. I commissioned to Monaim an opera sung in Arabic with his own choir. And a few years later, we commissioned him an opera called Kalila Wadimna. So I think, and that was sung in Arabic. So it was quite new in the festival to have operas sung in that language. But also we did several important participatory projects. One was The Monster in the Maze, commissioned to Jonathan Dove, and that was Simon Rattle conducting, Marie-Ève Signerol directing, and we had 300 amateurs on stage with an orchestra with half of professional musicians of the LSO and half of young musicians from the Orchestre des Jeunes de la Méditerranée. So I think those moments have been incredibly emotional, because when you get 300 amateurs on stage, it gives, and after 7 months of intense rehearsals, it gives a level of engagement that is not comparable to professionals. I don't think it's better or is less good. It's just different.
So it's a big work, an enormous investment, but also you get a lot of energy from it back.
Absolutely. And I think this is really what I very much believe in. I think we should try not only to bring music to people who are maybe far from it, especially far from our type of music, but we should also listen to the kind of the musical environment, to the cultures that are living in our cities today and which are much more diverse than they were half a century ago. So I think a festival today should probably keep its roots and its identity, but also should open it to the new communities that are joining us, migrants, refugees, people coming from other continents. And I think this makes the life in our cities much more rich.
And how did the festival then provide accompaniment for musicians who wanted to engage themselves in such social impact work?
Yeah, quite early, I would say, around 2010, we started a project together with the musicians of the LSO Discovery that we called Musiciens Relais. I don't know how to translate that in English. Young musicians.
Go between musicians or so, no?
Yes, and the very beginning of it was to train some of our best musicians, the best young musicians, to train less advanced musicians. But step by step, we did a lot with singers, chamber groups, string quartets, and so on and so forth, to give them tools to become more agile, more efficient in outreach programs, in community projects, in improvising with kids, and giving them tools to not only do their own music, but also trying to establish a bridge with other musicians, other communities, amateurs, sometimes going to hospitals, even psychiatric hospitals. And all that, I think, has been giving so incredibly intense events for those musicians. I think their life has been transformed by those events and those collaborations.
Yes, in a previous episode, Sarah Terry told us about how this work changed her as a musician, and that she's really different. She feels differently, and not only feel, but her position is different on stage after these experiences. And is this the program that is called Passerelle?
Passerelle is a program that worked with schools and associations. The young musicians, the Musiciens Relais, was done in cooperation with the academy, because it was about young professionals and Passerelle. And we had a lot of activities at school, in the social or cultural context that was required.
And so that was the academy is Émilie Delorme,
yeah,
who is now in charge of the conservatory, the famous Conservatoire de Paris. So we can hope that she's also going to introduce this kind of work at the Conservatoire de Paris.
I'm sure she will. Maybe just to give you an example, a very concrete example of this kind of project. I think it was in 2012, we wanted to establish a contact and a project with the community of people coming from the Comorian Islands, because there is a very large community, maybe 100,000 people in Marseille. Yes. So a lot of people are coming from those very poor islands in the south of Africa. And we were not sure what could be done. So we worked with them on lullabies coming from their own islands. And we made a group of maybe 8 women, their children, some teenagers, 2 or 3 musicians from the LSO and 3-4 musicians relais, those young musicians from Provence. Thierry Thieunang made the choreography and the mise en espace of it, staging, and Mark Withers conducted musically and made arrangements from those lullabies. It's been an extraordinary adventure for all of us, and we did the performance in Marseille, in Aix, and the people from the LSO were so impressed by what had happened that they invited it to London, to St. Luc, the studio of the LSO. And I think that experience was so important because for most of those people, I remember a woman who told me after the first night, this is the first time we are heard in our dignity, That was quite important to hear.
Hello, Andre de Quadros. Very good to have you again in the SIMM-podcast. And how to introduce you. You're a musician, you're a conductor, you're working in many different places, now in the United States especially, in detention centers, prisons, but you've been in Palestine. Maybe you can introduce yourself better.
Well, introduce myself is always difficult to say. So I'm not exactly sure the best way to introduce myself, but I am a Latino Asian. Sometimes I say that because that gives you already an understanding that it's a complex ethnic background, and I am actually in some ways a victim of coloniality. My original Hindu name was taken away from me by European colonization, and I was given a Portuguese name. And so that's kind of interesting. So, and my own life trajectory has very much informed my musical work. So, yes, as you rightly pointed out, Lucas, I work in prisons, but in detention in various forms, also on the border, U.S.-Mexico border, also in Indonesia a lot. Have been working in Israel and the Arab world for a long time. Also, if you remember, I may have mentioned to you, we did a project during the Iraq War, bringing people together from Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine to Jordan. And so different things in different places, and my work is at best, I guess, diverse and like my own life, really.
So I wanted to invite you again in the podcast because during this episode we're talking about these musicians who want to engage themselves, like yourself, in social and community music projects, but who need accompaniment, training, want to find ways to prepare themselves, or when they're working actively involved in programs, to be able to be accompanied and maybe to be in touch with other professionals who are also doing this work. And then you mentioned that when you worked in Scandinavia, you were in touch and were very actively involved with the Erik Erikson International Choral Center of Sweden, and that they propose a training for musicians, not only musicians, but also social workers and community workers who want to be engaged in such music projects. And I would like you to tell us a bit more about their work.
Yes. So what happened was I recognized and have recognized for a long time that people who want to be engaged as community music leaders or as music educators or in many different ways to engage in social action projects, in projects that are not the standard classroom music projects and so on that you might see, do not have enough either theoretical or practical grounding on how to proceed. This is clear and obvious, right?
What kind of grounding would you need at the theoretical and practical level?
Yeah, a good question. So I think theoretically, one of the fundamental questions is why you want to do this. And very often the why question is where you find a theoretical space for yourself. In other words, very often people think, but I want to do it because I think it should be done, or because they need it, or something like that, or because music will save the world, for example. So I think that asking the why question allows you to frame yourself theoretically. And in other words, what do you think, where do you place yourself in the issues of systems of power and systems of culture, systems of elitism, and all those kinds. So understanding that, and understanding how you position yourself as a pedagogue, how you position yourself as an activist, as a leader, are framed theoretically. But the why and the theory is only a first step. It's the second question, the second part of the question which you asked me, Lucas, is the how, the pedagogy.
But that comes very quickly out of the theoretical position.
Of course. But you're right, absolutely. But as somebody who has made lots of mistakes over more than 4 decades of work on my own side, I can say that it is not easy to step into environments that are unfamiliar and expect to know what to do. So we have all been in music classrooms, more or less. Or we've been in classrooms. We've been in schools. We know what schools look like. We know what schools look like, but we do not know what refugee shelters look like because we have not been there.
Yeah. And that means also, that makes me think that, okay, maybe you can propose like preliminary training or initiation, but then when the work starts, it's a continuing process of learning. And so also the further accompaniment, or maybe the word accompaniment is not so good, but the possibility to exchange with other people doing this kind of work is also an essential element of a follow-up and let's call it training and accompaniment. No?
Yes, I like those words, training and accompaniment. But coming back to your original question, Lucas, you asked me about the program
Sweden
that we initiated in Sweden. So having recognized that there wasn't enough of this grounding, we started conducting 21C musical leadership for a new century that we taught for many years at the Erik Erikson International Choral Center in Stockholm, and have taught the same program at Yale University here in the United States. And what was so interesting is to see when you are working in a different way for trained conductors or people who have advanced degrees, what that might mean, how you might be expected to frame yourself differently. I can give you one example. We took the conductors and educators into different settings. We took them to work with Afghan refugees. Now, for me, I understood immediately what was involved there. But for people who have never actually engaged with a refugee or someone from Afghanistan or somebody from a different faith background, or for somebody who has been brutalized by the trauma of forced migration, to know where to start and how to progress is a big learning thing, which you can't actually learn just in one session. So we have been engaging in this kind of, as you say, accompaniment and training. But I spent a lot of my time, every day almost, with mentoring people who really aspire to do something that's different.
It seems like it must be really important to be able to be in the now, because like you can't really know, because you can somehow, I guess, prepare more in terms of attitude and in terms of listening attitude and being in resonance with a particular situation. So to be very much present now.
Exactly, now. And you said two things which are key words here. You said now, and you said 3 words, present, and you said listening. So one of the things that I've been saying for a while is that musicians are very good at performing and not always very good at listening to other people's non-musical stories. So when we go there to be now, to be present, we actually say, we are going to listen. We're coming to listen. We're coming to learn. We have a lot to learn about your stories. We have a lot to learn about your life. And we have a lot to learn about the way you think about music and the way you make music, or the way in which you have been deprived of music. And so that's a learning space for us, meaning us as music educators. And so when I started to think about this music making as starting from listening and learning, even for us who are who've been doing this work for a long time, it changes completely. It starts with a position, a posture of humility. It starts from an atmosphere, like you say, of accompaniment, which just means to walk alongside. We will walk with you, or we will maybe walk behind you. We will hold hands together, which is a different concept to be me to be on the stage, you to be the audience. I'm in the front of the ensemble, you are in the ensemble. I'm making all the decisions or most of the decisions, and you are the subjects of my music.
And Andre, do you also stay in touch with the musicians who followed this program with you in the United States or in Sweden?
Yes.
Is there like a follow-up? Are there meeting times later on to see how people develop in their work?
Yes, it's so wonderful because so many people came to work with me over these years and still continue, of course, we have different courses in different places. It's so interesting to see people do the course, and then there's a project with homelessness. So there's a project in prisons, or there's a project on the border. There's something else and something else. And I'm astonished at the mushrooming of this kind of work, which is really inspiring. Well, I think it starts from a fundamental position, Lucas. The fundamental position is that we should not be satisfied with the world that we have at the moment. We should not be. Whether you talk about climate justice, whether we talk about income inequality, we talk about poverty, whether you talk about race and coloniality and hardship and brutality of all kinds, we should not be satisfied. That's the first. The second is we have to be activists for change in our own ways. Every single person, every single citizen, when we have privilege, like people like you and me, we have to exercise our privilege for change. And in this exercising of privilege, as musicians, doing our regular business and then doing some kind of social impact work or something on the side is, to me, not the way for us to do this. We have to make social impact work, social action work, social justice work the core of our work. Because when it's the core of our work, then music will be a space in which social change can happen, can be enacted. And we have to say that the world is not the world we want. We have to say enough, no more of the past. We have to start a new chapter. And in this new chapter, music is part of this new chapter of social change.
How?
Well, like I said, for each person, that pathway is different. You have to start with, yes, you might look for an issue that you feel strongly about.
No, not that how. I meant another how. I mean, how can we make the world better through music?
Well, the way I think about that is that we will solve the problems of the world at multiple levels and through multiple means. In other words, we have to solve at the policy level, at the legislative level, at other levels, right down to the micro levels of individual and relationships with the people we have close to us. So that's the first thing. There are the vertical changes that need to take place. At the other level of disciplinary changes, I think about this work as being team science. In other words, with teamwork. So music and musicians are not working by themselves. We're working with social scientists. We're working with medical people. We're working with scientists. We're working with other artists. So we are engaging as teams to solve and to deal with issues and problems and so on.
That teamwork, I imagine, is also an important element in preparing yourself for this work.
Of course, because musicians think that they're going to save the world through music. It's not going to happen, right? We have to say, we will join together. It's like your word earlier, you said accompaniment. Accompaniment takes multiple different ways of working. So not accompanying with people, but accompanying as disciplines, as colleagues, and so on.
And social and community workers and other people, they will be able to not only enrich your work if you work closely with them, but also give a lot of information about the people that you work with and what they may want and need.
Indeed. In every place, in every context, in every ensemble, in every classroom, in every shelter, in every location, it is different because it has to be different. We can't take formulas. There are no formulas.
It's quite something that you need to be capable of as a musician.
I was working in prisons. I've done all this kind of things, so many different places. So, and then I thought, okay, now I can go into juvenile detention, and this is years ago, and they didn't want to have us. They didn't want to have us. They were not interested in anything. They were not interested in us being in the same room with them. So we had to go back and start differently, and start with a totally different posture, a totally different way of even beginning the conversation. And after all of that, I thought, okay, you know what? Now I can work with people who are profoundly mentally ill, or people who have had shock treatment. And I thought, okay, so I can do that, because now I think I've solved every problem, which I hadn't. Of course, I wasn't thinking that at all, but I was thinking, well, I think I have enough skills to work with people who are profoundly mentally ill. And guess what? When I was working with them, I discovered, no, I do not. I have a lot to learn. So yes, we need to do a lot of training and education, and because people want to do this kind of work, and there are not many opportunities for them to actually gain the kind of skill to do this kind of work.
Sound engineer and co-editor of this episode of the SIMM-podcast is musician Mariusz Radwanski. Please visit our website at simm-platform.eu.